By late 1944, the United States Marine Corps had learned a brutal truth about the war in the Pacific. The closer they pushed toward Japan, the less the enemy relied on beaches, and the more they disappeared into the earth itself. At Peleliu, Marines expecting a short, violent assault like Tarawa instead found themselves staring at a natural fortress, an island carved from coral limestone, riddled with tunnels, firing slits, and caverns so deep and interconnected that no amount of naval gunfire seemed to matter. The Japanese had abandoned the banzai charges of earlier battles and replaced them with a defense-in-depth strategy designed to make every ridge, every slope, and every shadow a kill zone. The terrain was their ally, the caves were their shield, and American artillery, normally the decisive instrument of U.S. firepower, was all that helpless against rock. Marines would watch 155mm shells crash into the cliffs, exploding harmlessly against the surface while the soldiers inside remained untouched, waiting for the bombardment to end so they could continue firing. Peleliu's Umurbrogel Mountains became infamous almost overnight. To the men of the 1st Marine Division, they weren't mountains at all, but a maze of razor-sharp coral formations honeycombed with firing ports, sniper hides, machine gun nests, and interlocking tunnels that allowed defenders to move unseen from one position to another. They fired from cracks so small a Marine could barely slide a finger into them. They shifted between caves so quickly that even when Americans managed to silence one opening, fire erupted from a different slit a few feet away. The Marines began calling it the meat grinder. It was a place where visibility never extended beyond a few yards, where the terrain itself tried to cut your boots open, where rifle squads fought for hours just to move the line forward one boulder at a time. And this wasn't just Peleliu. Okinawa, the last and bloodiest battle of the Pacific, multiplied the nightmare on a continental scale. The Shuri Line, Japan's main defensive belt, ran through a terrain of caves, ridges, limestone cliffs, and underground bunkers so vast that entire regiments could vanish beneath its surface. The Japanese had spent months reinforcing every chamber, stocking them with ammunition, supplies, and medical stations. They had carved machine gun ports into the hillsides so cleverly that aerial reconnaissance often couldn't find them. When U.S. intelligence briefed units before the assault, they warned that the Japanese were shifting from surface war to subsurface war, and the Marines might as well have been fighting an enemy made of smoke. Shells did nothing. Bazookas barely scratched the surface. Grenades rolled back down slopes or disappeared into cracks too small to swallow their blast. And every time Marines pushed forward to close the distance, the Japanese unleashed coordinated crossfire from concealed positions, shredding entire platoons in seconds. In many caves, the defenders were equipped with Type 96 or Type 99 machine guns mounted on tripods anchored deep inside, firing through keyhole slits that provided perfect coverage of any approach, but offered almost no target in return. American mortars were ineffective because their rounds arced down onto the tops of the caves rather than into the openings. Flamethrower-less assaults turned into massacres. Marines tried blasting caves with dynamite satchels, only to watch the Japanese extinguish fires and resume shooting minutes later. They tried sealing entrances with rocks or sandbags, only to discover alternate exits on the opposite side of the ridge. They tried rushing the openings, but every Marine who stuck his head out from behind cover risked being killed by a rifleman aiming from total darkness. The Japanese defensive doctrine, shaped by General Naoyuki Nakajima and refined by commanders like Colonel Kunio Nakagawa at Peleliu, emphasized that caves should be used not as static bunkers, but as fluid systems. Fire from one opening, fall back through tunnels, reappear from a different angle, and continue fighting indefinitely. These positions were nearly immune to traditional bombardment. Even direct hits rarely penetrated more than a few feet. When the battleship USS Pennsylvania fired 14-inch shells at cave positions on Okinawa, the Marines advancing afterward found that the defenders inside were not only alive, but still organized and fully capable of resisting. The caves turned the Japanese infantry into something close to invincible. The psychological toll on American units was enormous. Imagine firing thousands of rounds, calling in naval gunfire, hurling grenades, all to silence a cave mouth, only for it to start spitting bullets again an hour later. Imagine watching a platoon fight all day for a single ridge, only to be stopped cold by a hole in the rock the size of a dinner plate. The Marines began writing home about an enemy who lived underground like ghosts, an enemy who used the island itself as armor, an enemy who could not be killed by the weapons the U.S. had relied on for the entire war. Something had to change, and it did, because the Americans brought to the Pacific one of the most terrifying weapons ever carried by a single soldier. A weapon that didn't need to pierce stone or hit precise openings. A weapon that didn't just kill, it cleared. It filled. It consumed. A weapon that turned sealed chambers into ovens and oxygen into fire. The Japanese had built their strongest defenses inside the earth, but deep inside those caves, behind those firing ports and tunnels, there was one thing they could not escape: heat. And the moment the Marines realized that, the war beneath the ground began to shift. The answer was the M2 Flamethrower, and once it arrived, Japanese defenders would learn in seconds that even their deepest caves were no longer safe.
The first time Marines watched an M2 Flamethrower used against a fortified cave, many of them went silent, not out of fear but out of realization. For months they had fought against an enemy who hid behind geology itself, an enemy who could shrug off shells, bombs, and grenades. But fire, real fire, projected under pressure, carried on liquid fuel that clung to rock and flesh alike, was different. Fire could go where bullets and explosives could not. Fire could turn corners. Fire could roll into chambers. Fire could consume oxygen in enclosed spaces. And the M2, the U.S. military's standard infantry flamethrower, was built for exactly that brutal requirement. The M2-2 flamethrower, introduced in 1943 and used heavily in 1944-45, was a compact but devastating machine. On a Marine's back were 3 cylinders, 2 outer tanks holding roughly 18 liters of fuel mixture, usually gasoline thickened with rubber tar or later napalm, flanking a central nitrogen pressurization tank. A flexible hose connected these tanks to a wand-like projector with twin triggers, one to open the fuel valve, the other to ignite it using a battery-powered pyrotechnic spark system. The moment the operator squeezed both triggers, a roaring jet of fire leapt from the nozzle at 20-40 meters per second, forming a stream of burning, sticky fuel that could keep burning for seconds on end and reach into spaces no human eye could see. In Okinawa's labyrinths and Peleliu's coral caverns, that mattered more than any engineer could have predicted. The weapon's effectiveness came not just from temperature, though the flame could easily exceed 1,000 degrees Celsius, but from physics. Confined spaces trapped heat, amplified pressure, burned oxygen, and created flashover effects that could kill defenders instantly even without touching them directly. Inside a sealed cavern, a 1-second burst of M2 fire could turn breathable air into a furnace. Inside tunnels with only a single entrance, even a half-second pulse could create a blast of superheated gas that traveled 20, 30, even 40 feet inward, igniting ammunition stores, cooking wooden supports, and detonating stockpiles of grenades or shell casings. No other infantry weapon could do this. The Japanese defensive doctrine, premised on absorbing artillery and outlasting bombardments, had no countermeasure for fire delivered under pressure. Their caves lacked proper ventilation. Even those with secondary openings were rarely wide enough to disperse the surge of combustible gas the M2 sent racing inside. And psychological shock played a role as well. Japanese soldiers were trained to face bullets, bayonets, and shells without fear. They were told to die in place. But nothing in their training prepared them for the reality of flamethrowers. A sudden torrent of fire exploding into darkness, lighting entire cavern walls in a hellish orange glow, filling tunnels with choking black smoke and boiling air in seconds. Survivors from Okinawa later recalled that the first burst made some men believe an entire ammunition magazine had detonated inside the hill. Others described the flame as a river of fire that no one could outrun or fight. The American flamethrower operators themselves were among the most vulnerable soldiers on the battlefield. Every Japanese marksman prioritized them. Every cave opening aimed for them first. A single tracer round into the fuel tank could turn a Marine into a walking bomb. Though in practice the tanks were surprisingly resistant to penetration. Flamethrower operators rarely survived long without support, which is why U.S. doctrine evolved quickly. A dedicated rifle squad guarded the flamethrower man at all times, suppressing firing ports with BARs M1 Garands, and grenade launchers the moment he stepped forward. This teamwork became standard. 2 Marines dragging fuel hoses, 1 Marine carrying the wand, and the rest of the squad firing relentlessly to keep Japanese heads down. At Peleliu, Marine officers noted that without this coordination, flamethrower operators rarely lasted more than 2 minutes. With it, they became the most decisive weapon on the battlefield. The first major demonstration of the M2's power hit the Japanese defenders like a shockwave. At Umurbergal, a Marine engineer tested the M2 on a cave that had resisted dozens of grenades and even direct hits from a Sherman supporting the assault. The moment he opened the wand, a jet of flame shot inside. 2 seconds later, the cave erupted from within, an explosion of igniting ammunition and burning vapors that sent debris flying from secondary slits in the limestone. The firing from that position stopped instantly. Marines watching from cover realized they had just witnessed something no artillery battery had ever achieved: an entire defensive node silenced in seconds. After-action reports recorded comments from stunned Marines who had spent days fighting over the same ridgeline. "We've thrown everything at that cave. He just walked up and burned it out." And the Japanese felt that shock even more. Defenders who survived the first flamethrower attacks wrote in diaries later recovered from caves on Okinawa and Peleliu. Some wrote that the flamethrower was the most terrifying weapon the Americans possessed, surpassing even battleship shells because there was no place to hide from it, not behind rock, not behind steel, not in darkness. Others described the suddenness. One moment we were alive, the next moment the cave was filled with fire. Flamethrowers turned cave warfare from a slow, grinding stalemate into a swift, brutal form of clearing operations. With each island the U.S. assaulted, the role of the M2 grew. And soon the Japanese would learn the full extent of what a single operator could accomplish, because the real test of the M2's power would come not on paper, but in the furnace-like ridges of Peleliu and the vast subterranean defenses of Okinawa, where entire cave complexes would be wiped out in seconds by one man carrying a tank of pressurized fire on his back.
The battle for Peleliu was already a nightmare before the flamethrowers arrived. The Marines of the 1st Marine Division had landed expecting a 3-day battle. Instead, they found themselves climbing into a labyrinth of coral ridges, sinkholes, and knife-edged cliffs that hid more than 500 interconnected Japanese defensive positions. The Umurbergal Mountains, later known simply as Bloody Nose Ridge, became the deadliest terrain many veterans ever faced. A place where the Japanese 14th Infantry Division, under Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, fought with a stubbornness and tactical ingenuity that exceeded anything encountered earlier in the Pacific War. For days, the Marines assaulted cave after cave with grenades, bazookas, and demolitions, only to see fire erupt again from the same slit hours later. It was in this hellscape, under blistering heat and constant sniper fire, that the M2 flamethrower proved itself in a way no one had fully anticipated. On the morning of September 19, 1944, a rifle platoon from K-31 attempted to take a cave complex dominating a narrow defile known as Five Sisters. The Marines had already lost one squad trying to silence the position. Machine gun fire poured from the cave's main opening and 2 flanking vents, creating a perfect crossfire that pinned down every approach. Grenades bounced off coral walls. Satchel charges were rolled toward the entrance but fell short, their blasts ripping only at the outer lip of the cave. Sherman tanks were brought up, but the coral spires were so jagged and tight that the armor couldn't aim its cannon without exposing itself to mines or hidden anti-tank rifles. The Japanese defenders, maybe 8 or 10 men, were safe behind meters of coral rock. They had food, water, ammunition, and the confidence that American firepower could not reach them. Then, a lone Marine corporal stepped forward with an M2 on his back. His name does not appear in most official histories. In Peleliu, flamethrower operators were wounded, killed, rotated, or replaced too frequently for many to be recorded as individuals. But his platoon remembered him. He crawled forward through shattered coral while his squad laid down suppressive fire with BARs and Garans. Tracers snapped past him from the secondary firing slit. He kept moving, inch by inch, until he reached a boulder less than 10 meters from the cave mouth. He rose just enough to aim the wand, and then he pulled both triggers. The jet of fire that erupted from the M2 did not simply wash over the rocks, it poured inside, sucked inward by the cave's natural ventilation pattern like air rushing into a furnace. In photographs taken later, one Marine described the flame as flowing horizontally, like a liquid tongue. The mixture of gasoline and thickener stuck to the cave floor, the walls, and the defenders inside. The heat, over 1,000 degrees Celsius, ignited stored ammunition. Within 3 seconds, a concussive blast shook the ridge as cartridges, grenades, and mortar rounds inside the cave detonated one after another. Black smoke belched from the secondary vents. The machine gun that had held off the Marines for 2 days went silent. When the flamethrower operator released the trigger, the cave was quiet. The Marines waited a moment, unsure whether the defenders had fallen back deeper into the tunnel system, but nothing moved. When engineers approached a few minutes later to check the damage, they found the interior scorched black, its defenders killed instantly by the blast of pressure and heat. It had taken less than 5 seconds. Stories like this spread across Peleliu within days. In one documented case, a flamethrower team from the 321st Infantry Regiment, attached from the Army's 81st Infantry Division, cleared an entire network of 4 caves in under a minute by applying fire sequentially through connected openings, creating a chain reaction of oxygen depletion and ammunition detonation inside the tunnels. In another, Marines used flamethrowers to silence a cave so deep that grenades thrown earlier had rolled backward down the slope toward the attackers, yet a half-second burst of flame still reached inside far enough to kill every defender. The Japanese, for their part, were stunned. Their diaries, later recovered in pockets and tunnels, recorded shock at how quickly their most hardened positions collapsed. One entry found on the body of a lieutenant read, "Our strong cave, which artillery could not break, was destroyed in a single moment by fire. The men inside died without time to fight." Another diary from a sergeant described the flamethrower as the weapon of hell, noting that the defenders in the caves could not breathe, could not see, could not even shout warnings before the fire filled the chamber. On Bloody Nose Ridge, where the terrain made every advance a brutal contest of meters, flamethrowers turned stalemates into breakthroughs. A rifle platoon that had spent 48 hours pinned beneath a sniper cave watched a flamethrower operator deliver a 2-second burst that not only killed the marksman inside, but ignited a hidden ammunition cache behind him, collapsing part of the ceiling and sealing the tunnel forever. And with every success, the weapon's reputation grew. Rifle squads adapted their doctrine around the M2. Suppression first, flamethrowers second, demolition last. Tanks equipped with auxiliary flamethrowers reinforced infantry assaults, saturating wider openings while M2 operators targeted narrow slits. Peleliu's coral fortress, designed to hold out for months, began to crumble cave by cave, ridge by ridge. But the most astonishing effect of the M2 wasn't physical, it was psychological. Japanese soldiers who had been ordered to fight until all ammunition is gone and then fight with stones suddenly understood they faced a weapon that could kill them even if they were hiding, even if they were dug 30 meters inside a mountain, even if they covered the entrance with stones or logs, fire would still find them. And for the first time in the Pacific War, defenders began abandoning some caves rather than suffer the fate they had seen inflicted on their comrades. Not many, but enough that commanders noticed. The men on Peleliu learned a harsh truth. Artillery could wound caves, explosives could shake caves, but flamethrowers could end caves. And as the sun fell over the jagged coral ridges, Marines who had believed the island was unwinnable finally had something they hadn't felt in days: momentum.
By the time American forces reached Okinawa in April 1945, the Japanese military had perfected the art of disappearing into the earth. Peleliu had been brutal, but Okinawa was something else. An island-sized fortress built on limestone, riddled with tunnels stretching kilometers under the ground, stocked with ammunition, medical stations, command posts, machine gun nests, and artillery rooms carved like chambers and a cathedral of war. The Marines and soldiers of the 10th Army quickly realized that every hill had a hollow heart, every ridge had 2 or 3 layers of defense, and every cave had a dozen exits hidden in brush, rocks, or sheer cliff faces. This was the Shuri Line, the largest, most lethal defensive system the Japanese ever constructed in the Pacific. When they saw it, some American officers predicted the battle would take months. They were right. But what no one predicted was how a single weapon, the M2 Flamethrower, would become the key that cracked open positions naval gunfire, airstrikes, and tanks could not dent. The first major test came along Kakuzu Ridge in mid-April. U.S. forces assaulted the ridge repeatedly, only to be cut down by machine gun and mortar fire erupting from slits so well concealed that even veteran scouts could barely detect them. Tanks rolled forward, fired point-blank into cave mouths, and then withdrew when hidden 47mm anti-tank guns emerged from different angles to fire into their flanks. The infantry was stuck. Artillery pounded the ridge with thousands of shells, but when the smoke cleared, the same firing slits lit up again, spraying bullets down the slope. The Japanese defenders were deep, well-ventilated, and confident that nothing short of an earthquake could reach them. What happened next shocked them. A flamethrower operator from the 27th Infantry Division crawled forward under covering fire, dragging the 70-pound weight of his M2 across a field of shattered stone. The Japanese spotted him immediately. Flamethrower men were always targets, and a wave of rifle and machine gun fire erupted toward him. But his squad returned fire with everything they had, bars rattling, garons cracking, grenades arcing toward the cave's vents. The operator reached a shallow fold in the rocks, just 10 meters from the main opening. He rose for a second, just enough. The M2's wand ignited with a snap, and a torrent of fire roared forward. What the Japanese inside felt was not heat at first, but a sudden, violent wave of pressure as the burning fuel shot inside and devoured the oxygen. Flames rolled through the cave system like a tidal surge. Ammunition stored deep inside detonated with a muffled boom. Secondary tunnels lit up, glowing orange from within. The firing stopped instantly. The squad that had spent 2 days pinned in place advanced in minutes. And at Shuri Castle, the Japanese command received the first alarming report. Enemy uses fire that enters deep tunnels. They did not know how deep until the next week when the Marines assaulted the Sugarloaf complex, a cluster of hills that formed one of the deadliest positions on the island. The Japanese 32nd Army had built a honeycomb beneath Sugarloaf, with tunnels connecting to Horseshoe Ridge and Half Moon Hill. They could move hundreds of soldiers underground without exposing a single silhouette to American spotters. When U.S. artillery concentrated on Sugarloaf, the defenders simply retreated into the earth and waited. When infantry advanced, they re-emerged and tore them apart. One Marine division lost nearly 1,600 men assaulting the same hill again and again. Then came the flamethrowers. In one documented engagement, a Marine flamethrower team approached a cave that had repelled 6 assaults in 2 days. Every time Americans neared the entrance, a hidden machine gun cut them down. The Marines coordinated, suppressing fire from 2 squads, smoke grenades tossed toward the vents, and a flamethrower operator who crawled up the slope so low he could feel the coral scraping his chest. When he opened the M2, the effect was immediate. Flames surged into 3 connected tunnels simultaneously. A geyser of smoke burst from a vent 20 meters away. Ammunition began popping inside the hill like firecrackers. The cave complex went silent in under 4 seconds. And something else happened. Something unprecedented. Japanese soldiers deeper inside the ridge began abandoning their posts. Not many, and never in mass, but enough that officers reported the first signs of defensive paralysis. The flamethrower was not just killing, it was breaking morale. Diaries recovered from dead Japanese officers show fear in ways rarely seen earlier in the war. One major wrote, "Our caves are ovens. The enemy fire flows inside like water." Another officer stationed near Kunishi Ridge reported that his men feared the fire more than death. They had expected bombs. They had expected shells. They had expected bayonets. But they had not expected this. One American with a tank on his back, capable of wiping out a fortified hideout in seconds. On Okinawa, the combination of M2 flamethrowers, demolition teams, and armor-mounted flamethrowers, especially the POA CWS H-1 Flame Shermans, became the formula for breaking the Shuri Line. Rifle squads suppressed, tanks poured flame into large caves. M2 operators advanced to finish the job. Engineers sealed entrances with explosives. Again and again, caves that resisted everything else fell in moments. One flamethrower operator later recalled, "We fought for days on Okinawa, but the caves, those were seconds." That was the horror and the power of the M2. In the largest cave war ever fought by the U.S. military, where geology itself fought against them, A single Marine or soldier could change the fate of an entire ridge with one pull of a trigger. And as the Americans pushed south toward the final redoubts around Shuri Castle, Japanese defenders, men trained to die without fear, began to realize the truth. There was nowhere the flame could not reach.
By the final weeks of Okinawa, the ground shook not just from artillery, but from the collective collapse of a defensive system that Japan had believed would stop the Americans for months. The Shuri Line, the pride of the 32nd Army, had been designed to survive bombardment, tanks, grenades, starvation, and even complete encirclement. What it had not been designed to survive was fire that entered from a single point and killed everything inside in seconds. The M2 flamethrower had become the one tool the Japanese had no counter for, no doctrine against, no courage sufficient to withstand. Its effect went beyond the physical destruction. It rewrote the psychology of cave warfare. Many Japanese defenders had expected to die, but they had expected to die fighting, firing rifles, swinging bayonets, detonating satchel charges in last stands. They had not imagined dying without firing a shot, buried alive by burning air. And that is exactly what the M2 inflicted on hundreds of cave positions from Peleliu to Okinawa. The Americans knew it too. After months of losing men inch by bloody inch, the flamethrower gave them something they had not experienced since the start of the campaign: control. A single operator could decide the fate of a cave that had resisted entire platoons. A squad with an M2 could finish in 30 seconds what days of bombardment could not. It was horrifying, effective, and brutally simple. And because it worked, it changed everything. The 10th Army's after-action reports revealed that the flamethrower was the single most effective infantry weapon for destroying Japanese cave defenses, surpassing even satchel charges and tanks in kill ratios. Marine Corps division summaries from Peleliu and Okinawa repeatedly stated that without flamethrowers, many ridges would have taken multiple additional weeks to clear, costing thousands more American lives. On Okinawa, flame tanks, Shermans fitted with POA CWS H-1 flame units, worked hand-in-hand with M2 operators. Tanks drenched large cave mouths in fire, while infantry flamethrowers crawled forward to finish the smaller vents and upper slits the tanks could not reach. The Japanese defenders trapped inside these caves often faced a choice more terrible than surrender or death: die by flame or take their own lives. Many commanders chose mass suicide rather than allow their men to be burned alive inside the tunnels they had spent months fortifying. American troops found bodies slumped near cave mouths, grenades still clutched in their hands, proof that the flame had broken not just positions, but wills. For U.S. forces, the M2 also revealed the grim logic of fighting an enemy determined never to surrender. Flamethrowers were not used lightly. They were used because nothing else worked, and because every hour spent fighting over one cave meant more dead Marines and soldiers. Officers wrote in field notes that the flamethrower was a weapon forced upon us by enemy tactics. And they were right. Japanese doctrine had embraced a war of attrition inside stone, where every tunnel was a trap and every slit a murder hole. The Americans responded with a weapon that rendered those fortresses obsolete. Yet even for those carrying the flamethrowers, the burden was heavy. Many M2 operators later admitted they had nightmares for years. They had watched fire rush into the darkness, heard ammunition cooking off, heard men screaming inside caves before the oxygen vanished and silence returned. They had carried the heaviest, most dangerous load on the battlefield, knowing every Japanese sniper wanted them dead first. The irony was cruel. The men who carried the most psychologically scarring weapon were also the ones least likely to survive. Flame operators had the highest casualty rates of any infantry specialty in the Pacific. Their average life expectancy in an assault was sometimes measured in minutes, and yet the war could not have been won without them. When American commanders reviewed the campaign after the war, one truth emerged repeatedly.
the M2 flamethrower saved more American lives than any other single infantry weapon in the Pacific. Without it, the Japanese cave systems would have bled U.S. divisions dry. Okinawa alone, with its mile-long tunnel networks under Shuri Castle, its labyrinth of interconnecting bunkers at Sugarloaf, Kakuzu, and Kunishi, might have dragged on for another month or more. Casualties already staggering would have doubled. When preparing for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan's home islands, U.S. planners assumed flamethrowers would be required at unprecedented scale. They expected caves even deeper, fortifications even thicker, defenses even more ruthless than Okinawa. The M2 had become not just a weapon, but the essential counterbalance to Japan's strategy of bleeding the Americans dry from underground. But history took a different turn. Japan surrendered before the mainland was invaded, and the cave systems of Kyushu and Honshu were never tested in battle. The M2's reign as the king of cave warfare ended abruptly with the war itself. The flamethrower would be retired decades later, its brutality no longer considered acceptable in modern conflict. Yet in the Pacific War, where nature favored the defender and humanity was pushed to its limits, the M2 was the only weapon that could reach into the darkness and force the battle to end. When veterans of Peleliu and Okinawa looked back, many said the same thing. Without the flamethrower, the Japanese caves would have been unbeatable. And within those caves, Japanese soldiers learned a truth more devastating than any bombardment or airstrike. The Americans had brought a weapon that could attack the very concept of a bunker. A weapon that did not need a direct hit. A weapon that turned stone into a conduit for fire. One man, one tank of fuel, one burst of flame, and an entire cave complex fell silent. That was the brutal, undeniable reality that stunned the Japanese defenders and reshaped the war beneath the ground.